Today I'm going to answer all the questions I received about long-term storage containers, including the questions you sent me about silica gel packs and oxygen absorbers and how all of this fits into your prepper pantry. Hi sweet friends, I'm Mary and welcome to Mary's Nest, where I teach traditional cooking skills for making nutrient-dense foods like bone broth, ferments, sourdough, and more. So if you enjoy learning about those things, consider subscribing to my channel and don't forget to click on the little notification bell below. That'll let you know every time I upload a new video. Well, I've received so many questions about the series of videos that I've been doing on long-term storage containers, as well as the silica gel packs and the oxygen absorbers and the Mylar bags and on and on and on. But I've done my best to try and answer them in the comments, but I also thought I would do a video to answer them here as well. And also I've got comments coming in as I'm making this video, so hopefully I can stay up to date and cover everything that everyone is asking me. Now, before I get into all the questions and the answers, I first want to just review where you can find various sources of information that go above and beyond anything that I'm sharing here. And there, if you open the description under this video, and you can do that by, depending on what device you're on, by clicking the word show more underneath the title of the video, or clicking on the actual title of the video itself, or sometimes there's a little upside down triangle or like a little downward arrow. If you click on that under the video, that'll open the description. It all really depends what device that you're working on. But if you open up the description, I'm going to have a link to the blog post, a direct link to the blog post over on my website that will correspond with this Q&A video. And in that blog post, I'll also have links to all the other videos that I've done about food storage containers and about silica gel packs, about oxygen absorbers, about Mylar bags, and also all of the various links to my entire Prepper Pantry series that covers how to stock your Prepper Pantry with real food, how to stock it on a budget, on about $5 a week, and so on and so forth. So there's a lot of information, and I will put all of that into my blog post. And in that blog post, I will also have links to all the authoritative sources that I use to educate myself about the long-term storage of food in a prepper pantry, or an extended pantry as I also call it. And some of those sites include the Latter-day Saints organization, which is a religious organization, but they are considered an authoritative source on long-term food storage, and they have a wealth of information that they share with the public. I'll also have links to Utah State University's Extension Service, which also is an authoritative source on long-term food storage. Plus, I'll also link to the download they have of a book, and I think it's like an ebook, but it's free, and it's like maybe like 85 pages long, and it's all about long-term food storage, so it's incredibly helpful. I'll also link to the page on the Food Saver site, the machine that sucks all the air out of various storage things, that lists all the foods on their website that they feel is approved to be used with their Food Saver devices. And then I'll also link to USA Emergency Supply. And that site has a wonderful information, and it goes over a lot of information about Mylar bags and using them with oxygen absorbers, and what foods you can put in a Mylar bag with an oxygen absorber, what size Mylar bag needs what size oxygen absorber, and depending on what food you put in your Mylar bag, and depending on what size the bag is, what size oxygen absorber you need. They go into great detail on all of this. So be sure to check the link for the blog post in the description under this video. because that blog post is just going to be chock full of very helpful information if you're interested in learning more about long-term food storage. And just as a little aside, I want to share this here because a number of you have asked me about this. And some of you have said, why don't you put all these links in your pinned comment? Why do you put the link to your blog post in the description? And the reason some of you have asked me that is because you have trouble figuring out how to open the description. So that's underneath the video. So hopefully what I explained before about clicking on show more or the title or the little down arrow, depending on what device you're working on, will help you be able to open the description. Now I know some of you have told me that you watch this on Roku and you don't see any of these various things that may come across, like iCards or notes or the description. And that I don't really know how to work around. All I can say is just head over to my website of marysnest.com, and you should see the blog post over there when you are on some type of device like a computer or your phone. That'll have all the links and information that you need. But you've asked me this and asked why I don't put everything in the pinned comment. And the reason is sometimes if I put links in the pinned comment that are going to go to a source that's outside of YouTube, I can't be guaranteed 100% that that comment will appear. YouTube, when they're putting comments for the public to see, may not be sure where that link is going or whatever the case may be. I'm not really sure how it works, but it may be dumped into spam. And my spam folder is very full with a lot of different things, and I don't go through it. Often there are comments with links that are going out of YouTube, or sometimes, inappropriate things, and YouTube is very good about catching those things. So in any event, that's why I don't put links in the pinned comment unless it's linking to another video of one of my friends that I'm telling you to go visit or whatever the case may be that's in YouTube. So hopefully you can figure out how to open the description, but if not, be sure to just head over to marysnest.com and hopefully you'll see the blog post right over there and it'll be easy for you to access. Alrighty, now with all that housekeeping out of the way, we're going to get to the questions. And I just want to mention that I will put timestamps in the pinned comment. They'll be in the description, but I'll also put the timestamps in the pinned comment if there's a particular issue that you want to jump ahead to. So if I'm covering something that's not interesting to you, you can certainly look in the pinned comment at all the different timestamps and fast forward to the question and answer that is most interesting to you. Now, as I had mentioned earlier about the Food Saver website and the USA emergency supply site, that brings us to our first question. And it's a great one because a lot of people have asked me, Mary, can I store dried fruit in a Mylar bag with an oxygen absorber? Or can I store dried fruit using some kind of food saver equipment? Can I store it in a food saver bag or in a jar with the attachment that sucks out all the air? What can I do with dried fruit? And that's a great question. First of all, let's address dried fruit in a Mylar bag with an oxygen absorber. Don't do it. And the reason is dried fruit is a high moisture food. And so you cannot store high moisture foods with oxygen absorbers because you could create an environment where botulism could proliferate. And botulism is a poison. And this is not just my personal opinion. This is information that I have learned from the Latter-day Saint site and the Utah State University Extension Service, where they list all of the foods that you cannot store with oxygen absorbers. And one of them is dried fruit. Caveat, they say that if your dried fruit, and they also include dried vegetables, has been dehydrated, so this is a little different than just dried, has been dehydrated and sufficiently dehydrated to the point where it is completely dry inside and out, and you can snap it, it's crisp and you can snap it, then these authoritative sources say that you can store dehydrated fruits and vegetables that are very dry. They'll wind up having 10% or less moisture, that these very dry, dehydrated fruits and vegetables can be stored in a Mylar bag with an oxygen absorber. Now, what about dried fruit and a food saver, whether it's food saver bags or food saver containers? Where does dried fruit fall into all of this? Well, when you go to the food saver site that lists all of the food that you can store using a food saver, and one of the various options that they offer, whether it's jars or using a jar adapter on a canning jar, or whether it's a food saver bag, whatever the case may be, when they list all of the foods that you can use or that you can preserve using a food saver device, they do not list dried fruit on that main list of foods. However, if you dig a little deeper on their site, they do discuss what they say is dehydrated fruit, like we just discussed. But then it's very confusing, because under dehydrated fruit, they use the terminology dried fruit. But then they don't give you a definitive answer. They refer you to the U.S. Emergency Supply site. And when you go over to the U.S. Emergency Supply site, they do not use the term dried fruit. They use the term dehydrated fruit. And then that brings us back to the Latter-day Saint sites and the Utah State University Extension Service site that says dehydrated fruit, and also in their case vegetables, means something that is very dry, 10% or less in moisture, completely dry inside and out, and something that you can break that is crisp. So based on all of that, I would not feel comfortable storing dried fruit, definitely not in a Mylar bag with an oxygen absorber. But based on what we've just discussed, I personally would not feel comfortable storing traditional dried fruit like raisins and cranberries and apricots that are very moist. I would not be comfortable storing them in any type of food saver storage container. And when I say storage container, I'm also talking about the plastic bags that they provide, or a canning jar where you're using the jar adapter to suck out the air. I just wouldn't be comfortable doing that. Now, I know there are people on the internet who disagree with the Latter-day Saints and the Utah State University Extension Service and USA Emergency Supply, and that they have their own opinions on this. So what I would recommend is, I've shared with you what I've researched and what I would do in my humble opinion, but I would highly recommend that you research this and see what other people say and other people do in conjunction with what I've shared with you, and then make your own informed, educated decision as to what you're most comfortable doing. But as I said, in my humble opinion, I wouldn't get involved with anything like dried fruit, dried veggies, jerky, any moist food like that. I don't want to get involved in trying to store that in some sort of oxygen-free environment. I don't think it's smart, or air-free environment. Instead, what I think is the best way to store dried fruit that's very moist and pliable is to simply put it in some kind of jar or bag, just a traditional Ziploc bag from your grocery store, and maybe put in a silica gel pack that helps keep some, but not all, but some of the moisture at bay, so that you prevent the development of mold, which is often a problem with moist foods. Now, many times when you read the package, it says once opened, refrigerate. So you may want to refrigerate your raisins, or refrigerate your cranberries, or your dried plums, or so on, your apricots, so on and so forth. But if you're looking for some way to store these things for long-term food storage in the event that you didn't have the option of a refrigerator, then either in the original package that it came in from the store before it's opened, or maybe, as I had mentioned, in some sort of sealed container like a Ziploc bag or a jar with a lid, and maybe a silica gel pack that is not going to make it real hard, you know, just a small silica gel pack that'll take care of some of the moisture but not all, but hopefully will tamp down the development of mold. And when I'm saying that this will tamp down the development of mold and you're storing it in a plastic bag or some sort of jar with a lid, this is assuming that it's being stored in a pantry at room temperature. I would think that if you store these things in the refrigerator, none of this is necessary. The next question I got, and I want to mention that regarding the dried fruit and the other questions that I'm going to cover today, a lot of these questions, I got a lot of questions, but a lot of the questions were repeats. So overall, there are only a few areas that we really need to cover here, but in the 100 or 200 or 300 questions that I received in comments, they were often asking the same thing. So hopefully I'm hitting on everything. But if I don't, be sure to leave me a comment in this video, and I will try to answer you in the comment if it's something that I'm not covering. The next question that I got a lot of is, can you use an oxygen absorber and a silica gel pack together, whether it's in a Mylar bag or a bucket or whatever the case may be? Can you use them together? And that's a great question, and the answer is no. And the reason is, as we mentioned, oxygen absorbers can only be used when being stored with foods that have 10% or less moisture. But the little bit of moisture they have is what allows the chemical reaction to take place that makes the oxygen absorber work. So if you had an oxygen absorber and a silica gel pack that might suck out all the little bit of 10% or less moisture that's there, then your oxygen absorber can't work. And I'll explain why in a minute. But when you use an oxygen absorber, it's going to pull out the oxygen, and it's basically going to make your stored food a moisture-free environment. How an oxygen absorber works is that it is filled, the little bag is filled with iron powder. And what happens when iron is exposed to oxygen? The iron powder rusts. Now, I'm not a scientist, and my explanation may not be very scientific, but the bottom line is, when that iron powder rusts because of that little tiny bit of moisture in the 10% or less food that you're storing it with, when that iron powder rusts because it's being exposed to that little bit of moisture, that chemical reaction of rusting uses up or absorbs, in essence, the oxygen that's in the area where that oxygen absorber is. So basically, the bottom line is that all we need to know as home cooks at home and trying to store our food best we can is that the oxygen absorber needs that little bit of moisture that's in our very low moisture food, and it rusts, it absorbs the oxygen, and then it causes the bag to seal. And I've got one right here. This is a Mylar bag. This was sealed maybe about 12 or so hours ago. And you'll see this is one that I just sealed a few minutes ago. And hopefully you've seen this video where I showed you how to do this. But this one I just sealed a few minutes ago, and as you see, it's very loose and you can shake it around. But you're going to leave this for, 12 hours or 24 hours, maybe 48 hours. It depends what you've stored in it and what size your bag is. But this, after about 12 hours, as you'll see, the oxygen is really it's become like very hard, and the oxygen is being sucked out of it by the oxygen absorber that's in the bag with it. And when I say sealed with the oxygen absorber, what I mean is that I put my food in here, I put my oxygen absorber in here, but then I seal the top of this with something hot. I just use a home iron, which you'll see in the other video. But yes, you do seal it with something hot. So I meant that I sealed it with the oxygen absorber in it, and it'll just start to crinkle up on like this on you after, like, this is about, as I said, 12 hours or so, and then after 24 hours it's probably going to be like real hard, like a brick. But in order for this to happen, that oxygen absorber does need that 10% or less of moisture that's in this food, that's in here. So no, you never want to mix an oxygen absorber with a silica gel pack, because then otherwise the oxygen absorber doesn't have what it needs to do its job. And another question that I got about Mylar bags and oxygen absorbers is that should you be putting bay leaves in here as well? And that's an interesting question. It's nothing I've ever done, and I've not really seen any information about this on the internet, but I would think that it wouldn't be necessary, because you're sucking all the oxygen out and you've sealed it tightly on the top here. So it's really not something that bugs are going to get into. And so if there are eggs in here, the fact that there's no oxygen in here would make it an incredibly unhospitable environment for those eggs to hatch. Now, is it definitely 100% guaranteed that that egg isn't going to hatch? I don't know. I never want to say 100%. But I think the fact that it is a unhospitable environment, that it's an oxygen-free environment, that bugs for the most part, I can't imagine surviving or hatching. And even if they did, the bay leaves aren't going to help you out, because they're really just to deter bugs. They don't kill bugs. And you're basically already deterring bugs by storing your food in a Mylar bag. And then that brings us to another question that I got. Well, Mary, isn't this overkill? Because in your food storage container video, you talk about, why do I have to go through all this rigmarole to do this and then put this in a bucket? And that of one of the 5-gallon heavy-duty storage buckets. And that's a good question. And the reason is, yes, you can just go ahead and put whatever food you want in your 5-gallon bucket, and then with your oxygen absorbers, the food that's appropriate to be stored with oxygen absorbers, and put that in your bucket and put that away for long-term storage. But keep in mind now, every time you open that bucket, you're exposing those oxygen absorbers to air. And if you're thinking then you're going to close your bucket and your food is going to protect it, that may not be the case, because your oxygen absorbers may have already done their job and are basically spent. They can't absorb any more oxygen. So you've now let oxygen into your large container, and then you're closing it up again. And if you're hoping it to have a long-term storage effect, it may not, because you've exposed it to oxygen and now there's oxygen in it, which can begin to oxidize, as in damage your food. So if you're storing food in one of those buckets that you go into and out of a lot, you don't want to put in an oxygen absorber. It doesn't make sense. But as I shared with you, what Lisa Sutton over at Sutton's Days, I think is the name of her YouTube channel, recommended was to maybe break up your food into 1-gallon Mylar bags. So this 1-gallon Mylar bag holds about 5 pounds of rice, and then go ahead and put this in your bucket, and then every time you need rice or beans, whatever you're storing, in your Mylar bag, you open your bucket and then you just take out one bag of whatever it is you need, and all of the other food is fine and it's undisturbed because it's stored in Mylar bags. And then that brings us to the other question I got, that although I addressed this in the video, I know that not everybody gets to watch the whole video, but I addressed the fact that, and some of you had asked, oh, isn't that overkill? Why can't I just go ahead and put this on my shelf? And yes, you can go ahead and put this on your shelf if you know wherever you're storing it in your prepper pantry, your extended pantry, is a rodent-free environment, because rodents can chew through this. And yes, they can also have been known to chew through heavy-duty buckets and other types of plastic containers, but it is more difficult for them, and they may be more discouraged. So this protects them, your Mylar bag, in that way. And second, Mylar bags are not completely, even if you get a heavy-duty one, they're not perfect. And if, say, you put them on a wire shelf or a rough surface and they got a little snagged, they can rip. Or they can even get little tiny holes that you may not even notice that then damage your seal, in essence. They're no longer going to be oxygen-free and airtight like this. So storing your Mylar bags in some sort of protective container can be a really smart idea. And some of you shared an idea which I absolutely love, and I mentioned this in the video where I showed you how to seal the Mylar bags, and it literally takes seconds. It's so easy to do. This idea that some of you left for me in the comments I thought was so clever, that instead of using the 5-gallon buckets, which sometimes maybe is not the most efficient use of space in terms of putting in these Mylar bags, but that you get these large like Rubbermaid type containers that are heavy duty and have a lid, and then you just line these up in your large container, and then whenever you need some of your food, you just go ahead and pull one of these out, but that because they're beautifully lined up like little envelopes, that you make maximum use of your space. Next, I had a lot of questions about all-purpose flour and or bread flour, what some of you may call plain flour or white flour. But the bottom line is these are flours that have had all the bran and germ removed. Can they just be stored in a 5-gallon bucket where you're going to be accessing it on a regular basis? Yes. And does it make sense to put in an oxygen absorber? No, because you're going to be opening it on a regular basis. Can you put in some silica gel packs if you live in a particularly humid or your humid area, or you're storing it in an area that may be very moisture rich? Sure, you can do that. But you're going to really have to monitor it, because a lot has to do on the climate and where you live. Some people say that if they put silica gel packs with their flour, it does get very hard and cakey. Other people say it really helps keeping it from not getting a damp feeling. So that, again, research a little based on where you live and what others in your area have found to be most helpful. But generally, white flour in one of those 5-gallon food-safe buckets with the snap-on airtight lid or the Gamma airtight lid will preserve it very well for at least up to 1 year. Others say up to 2 years without taking on any off flavor. And many of you shared that you stick some bay leaves in your flour to discourage bugs, and that works out great. But now what if you want to store white flour that's had the bran and germ removed in a Mylar bag with an oxygen absorber? Yes, you can do that. And then you can maybe store it in 5-pound, 1 gallon, it can be 5 pounds of flour, white flour, store it in a Mylar bag with an oxygen absorber, and then again maybe in another container where you just line them all up, and whenever you're ready to bake, if you don't bake on a regular basis, you can go ahead and pull out your Mylar bag of flour, and this extends the life considerably. But I really want to stress that we are talking about white flour. We're not talking about whole grain flour. Now, can you store whole grains, the actual grain that has not been ground into flour, but is in its whole grain form? Can you store that in a 5-gallon bucket with some oxygen absorbers, the appropriate amount, for long-term storage? Yes. But you cannot do that with whole grain flour, because once whole grain flour is ground, once the whole grain is ground into the flour, it's a little too oily of a food to be safely stored with oxygen absorbers. Now, can you go ahead and just put it in your 5-gallon bucket and maybe throw in some silica gel packs to help keep the moisture down, depending on where you live? Definitely. And if you're accessing it on a regular basis, it should last you somewhere from 6 months to 1 year. But can you put whole grain flour in a Mylar bag with an oxygen absorber? No. It's the same situation as to why you can't put whole grain flour in a 5-gallon bucket with oxygen absorbers. Whole grain flour is an oily food, and so it's not appropriate to be stored with an oxygen absorber, because you could create a friendly environment for botulism. And as we shared, botulism is a poisoning, and so we don't want to store foods that have more moisture than, you know, as I said, more moisture than what's considered a dry food. If it's got 10% or less of moisture, you can store it with an oxygen absorber. If it has more than 10% of moisture, which is what is the case with whole grain flours, they cannot be stored with oxygen absorbers. Now, I know in a format like this, it can get a little confusing. What can you store with an oxygen absorber? What can you store with a silica gel pack? And what type of storage container is best? Whether it's a Mylar bag or a 5-gallon bucket or whatever the case may be. And the information is so large that it's more than I can just share with you in a video, as well as I may not know specifically what food you're thinking of storing. And that's why I want you to go over to my blog, because I'll have those links that I mentioned and to those various authoritative sites that will list out for you all of the foods that can either be stored with oxygen absorbers or without oxygen absorbers, or with a silica gel pack or without a silica gel pack, and so on and so forth. So all of that information will be over on that blog post for you. And this is not a question, but this is something that I mentioned in my video where I was talking about all the different options for long-term food storage. And one of them was talking about the food saver, and how this food saver has this little device that then can be used to suck the air out of the food saver bags and the food saver jars. But I wasn't sure how this could be used similar to the handheld, the old-fashioned handheld food saver handheld device that sucks oxygen out of jars when you like canning jars, when you use the jar adapters. But I learned this one, the new one that they have, this piece comes off very easily, because if you have this piece on, it just doesn't work very well with the jar adapters. But if you take this piece off, there's this little nub here, and you just put that in the hole on your jar adapter, and it works very well for sucking out the air. But I could not figure out for the life of me how to do that with this little new piece that comes actually connected to the food saver. And so many of you chimed in, and I really appreciate it, because I was thinking, gee, am I going to have to unscrew the bottom? And they were like, no, don't unscrew the bottom. Pull off this entire thing, and that's how you do it. Now, I was afraid to break it because it's stiff, but if you give it a good pull, there's the little nib, see? And it's very similar to the other handheld food saver device, the new one. And then you just put this into your jar adapter, and then you can suck the air out of your canning jars. So that was very clever, you know, for whatever food you're storing in there that's appropriate based on the food saver list. And then you just can pop this right back on, and you'll hear it. This actually, as I said, this was not as easy to get off as the other one. And there we go. See, you hear the click. And then you're all set. So thank you for sharing that tip with me. Another question that I got was, how long does it take for bugs to be attracted to your stored foods? That's a great question, but I really don't know. I think it's really a matter of how well you've stored your food and where you've stored it, and if you've taken any precautions as to kill eggs, such as freezing it in advance or putting it in an oxygen-free environment, and so on and so forth. So that's a tough one to give a definitive answer on. But in that question was also the question is, can you reactivate the oxygen absorbers in the microwave? And I am so glad I saw this question, because you can definitely not reactivate your oxygen absorbers in the microwave. Your oxygen absorber, as I said earlier, is filled with iron powder. Iron is a metal, and you never want to put metal in your microwave. And as to just reactivating oxygen absorbers in general, I don't think, at least I've not been able to find any information on this, but just from a practical standpoint and thinking about it, I can't imagine that that would be possible, because the iron powder has already rusted and done its job. And the next question is a very good one too. It says, can you reuse Mylar bags? And that's a great question. And yes, you can reuse Mylar bags. When you open this bag, you're going to basically cut this across the top and be able to access your food in it, and then you could always reseal it if you wanted, but you need to put in a fresh oxygen absorber, so it doesn't really make sense. So you really want to store your food in bags that are appropriate to a size that you feel you'll use, like, you know, within whatever the normal shelf life is, 6 months to a year, so on and so forth. But you're going to cut this off, and you're going to be able to access your food. You could transfer it to a food storage container that you like to use in your working pantry, or you can just fold over where you've cut and use one of those nice big clips, you know, food storage bag clips or something like that. But when you're all done using the food in here, you know, whether you leave it in here, as I said, with a storage clip once you open it, or you dump it into a different type of container, you're left with this bag. And yes, you can reuse it. Now, it's going to be a little smaller because you will have cut this off, or actually you can turn this around, and there's a little notch here, which I showed you in the food storage container video, and you can just cut it across that way too. It's really up to you what you want to do. But I think either way, yes, once you open this, you can reuse it. You can, you know, once it's empty, you have a Mylar bag that you can reuse, but you will need a new oxygen absorber, and one that's an appropriate size based on the chart over at USA Emergency Supply that is appropriate to the size of your bag. Now, this is another great question that I got, and the person says, can I store, for example, rice in a Mylar bag? And that's actually what I have in here. I have jasmine rice in here, white rice. Can I store, for example, rice in a Mylar bag without oxygen absorbers? I store some rice with oxygen absorbers, but the bag seems to have some air in it. Is that safe? That's a great question. Say you store your bag like this, and even after 12, 24, 48 hours, it pretty much still looks like this. And it doesn't look like this one that's gotten a lot harder and definitely appears that oxygen has been pulled out of it. Well, what that might mean is that it could be that the oxygen absorber for some reason had already been spent. Maybe it hadn't been stored appropriately and wasn't able to do its job, so it wasn't able to pull out the oxygen. The other possibility is that the oxygen absorber that you used wasn't the right size, and so then it did some of its job, but it could only take out so much oxygen and some was left. Third could be And this is not something I've experienced, but that I've seen other videos on YouTube where people have talked about this, that even after 12, 24, whatever, 48 hours, whatever time passes, their bag doesn't look like it's changed very much. And they say in their video that you have to keep in mind that the oxygen absorber is only removing oxygen. I don't know if you heard that. That's my dog Ovi's collar. She's shaking her head. And that it's only removing oxygen. It's not removing all the air. And there is also nitrogen in air, and there's a lot more nitrogen in air than there is oxygen from what they're saying in their video. So it could be that there's just the nitrogen that's left. And so the oxygen absorber did the best that it could, but there was just a lot of air in your bag before you sealed it, and so there's just some nitrogen in there. So there are some reasons why the bag may not look the way this bag looks. And so she goes on to ask, is that safe? And as I said, this has not happened to me, but what I have found in my research and watching others, they feel that the food is safe because basically it's stored in a somewhat airtight container. There is air in there, so it may not be perfectly stored in terms of preventing some oxidation of the food from the air, but that for the most part, yes, it's safe to eat. And it's just a matter of it may be becoming a little more stale quicker than it might be under circumstances like this, if there's air in there. Now, nitrogen is a different situation. It doesn't oxidize the food. Apparently, it doesn't have an effect on the food. So if there's just a lot of nitrogen in there, then maybe the food will stay fresh. But I highly recommend that if this is something that you're experiencing when you're sealing your Mylar bags, to do a little research on this to learn what others have experienced and they share their thoughts on this, and then you can make a better informed decision if you feel the food is fresh or safe or whatever the case may be. And another question that I had was, can you make a video about using plastic soda and juice bottles with oxygen absorbers for long-term storage? And that's a great request. But I don't have plastic soda bottles or juice bottles, so it's not something that I generally use to store food. However, that said, the links that I mentioned that'll be over on my blog, specifically the link to the Latter-day Saints site and the Utah State University Extension Service site, do talk about how to properly store food for long-term storage in plastic soda and juice bottles, and what you need to look for, and what type of bottles they need to be, and so on and so forth. So I highly recommend looking at that blog post and clicking on those links. I think you're really going to find those links invaluable resources, because those of you who have clicked on them, and specifically the one from the Utah State University that has that downloadable, like about 80 some odd page download that's all about food storage, you have said that that's just fantastic, and I agree. That covers everything. So definitely head over to the blog and get those links. Now, the other thing I want to mention is that some of you mentioned to me that you found me because you were visiting with Denise over at her YouTube channel, This and That with Denise. Denise is my friend. And so definitely, if you are not familiar with Denise, be sure to head over to her channel. As I said, it's This and That with Denise, and I'll put a link to her channel in the pinned comment. And she's been doing a lovely Prepper Pantry series. You know, the month of September is Preparedness Month, and so that's why so many of us have been doing Prepper Pantry series. So I highly recommend heading over to Denise and checking out her Prepper Pantry series of videos. And another friend of mine that I want to share with you is Heidi. And I know many of you already know Heidi. She has the channel Rain Country Homestead. And she is a wonderful resource for all things prepper pantry, preparedness, whatever you want to call it. Even though September is Preparedness Month, it's Preparedness Month every month over at Heidi's. So be sure to check out her channel because she has so much information on how to store food, and she's been doing a wonderful series of videos over the last couple of weeks on how to store all different types of food, and I think that you'll find it really interesting. And also, while you're at it, another friend of mine, her name is Robin, she has a wonderful site, YouTube channel called Faith and Flour, as in bread flour. And she's been doing somewhat of a prepper pantry series as well. And if you need help being neat and organized and efficient when it comes to putting together a prepper pantry, she's your go-to gal. She is so organized. It's amazing. Most of the videos on her channel have to do with cleaning and organizing and whatnot. She's a true inspiration. And so be sure to check out Robin and tell her I say hi when you're over there, because she's just a wonderfully sweet lady, as is Denise too. They're both delightful. And Robin is very good at showing you how to be incredibly organized and efficient. I think you're going to be very pleased with her series of prepper pantry videos. And one other friend of mine that I want to mention, who is just terrific, and he's more got a gardening channel, but he does some cooking and so on and so forth. But the reason I want to share his channel with you, it's called Ession's, and I'll put a link into it because it's an unusual spelling, but Ession's Family Garden, and him and his wife and their 2 sons. But he, during this Preparedness Month, has been doing pressure canning. And a lot of you, not specifically with these videos, but in other videos I have, you have been asking me a lot of questions about pressure canning. Now, I have a lot of videos on water bath canning, and I have a whole playlist, which I'll definitely link in the description and in the pinned comment, and if I remember in the iCards too. But if you're interested in pressure canning, Rob has a great video on pressure canning, but he kind of takes it one step further, and that's why I'm kind of mentioning it in this Q&A on storage and prepper pantry storage and so on and so forth, because he takes you on a tour of his prepper pantry, showing how his wife stores her canned goods, her pressure canned goods. And they may have water bath canned goods too, but he shows how she does it in an organized fashion, and I think it's very clever. And how she labels everything and makes it very clear. In the video, he's funny because he jokes that she feels that he's very forgetful. I don't know about that. I think he's joking, but that he's very forgetful, and so her labeling system makes it very easy for him to know what's what. And I really like the tip that she shares, because it's a very clever system that doesn't require you to label every single jar individually. She has a little bit of a different system with a specific type of signage that she assigns to her pressure canned goods. So I'll definitely link to that video and check that out, where the part where he takes you on that tour of all of their pressure canned goods and how they store them in their prepper pantry. And getting back to the questions and answers, this was a very interesting, this was a comment on my, which video is this? This is the oxygen absorbers versus silica gel packets video. And this was actually just a very interesting comment that I wanted to share with all of you in the event that any of you have young children, where I talk about how the silica gel pack and the oxygen absorber are not to be eaten. So be very careful when you store them with, especially if you have young children. And this person made a very good point that I wanted to share with you. that the silica gel isn't necessarily poisonous to eat, but it's a choking hazard because, you know, just like you would with, you know, if you've taken care of infants and you see that basically what it is the silica gel that's in the diaper and how that expands when it absorbs moisture. Well, it's the same thing happens with those silica gel packs that we use to protect and preserve our food. And if you eat that, they will absorb the moisture and swell up, and obviously in your throat would create a choking hazard. So be very careful about those. And another question I got was, can the silica gel packets found in vitamin bottles be reused? Excellent question. I don't think so. And the reason is those little silica gel packets that you get in the vitamin bottles generally don't have any kind of indicator as to when they're fresh and when they've absorbed all the moisture they're going to absorb. And so you really have no way of knowing what state they're in. And secondly, if they don't have some type of indicator on them from the manufacturer, you have no way of knowing if there's something, if they are the type of silica gel pack that can be basically reused by being reinvigorated, more or less, basically dried out in the microwave. Certain silica gel packs that are sold with indicators, they may be one color when they're dry and another color when they're wet. The manufacturer will include directions with those type of silica gel packs as to how you can dry those out in your microwave and then reuse them. Now, some silica gel packs do not come with those indicators, and the manufacturer says, do not try to dry these out, do not reuse these. Now, there is information on the internet about how people go against what the manufacturer says and dries out their silica gel packs that don't have those moisture indicators in the oven. But as I shared in this particular video where I talk about the difference between silica gel packs and oxygen absorbers, is that the information on how to dry out silica gel packs in your oven, the information that's available on the internet about this, when they don't have that moisture indicator with directions from the manufacturer on how to do it properly in the microwave, the information that's shared on the internet is kind of all over the place. It's very confusing. Some people make it sound very easy, some people make it sound very difficult, and some people give a real word of caution about the whole process. So it's not something I would ever be comfortable doing, and it's not something I would ever recommend. So my answer would be, should the gel packet found in vitamin bottle be reused, or can it be reactivated? I would just say I think it's best to discard it. Another question I got, and this actually just came in a few hours ago before I started filming this video, and this is an interesting question. She asks, is using an oxygen absorber the same sort of process as using a vacuum sealer? And no, it's not the same process. They're different reactions. When you use an oxygen absorber, you're pulling out just the oxygen, as we discussed, and there's left behind other air like nitrogen. Now, with a food saver, I think you're pulling out all of the air, if I understand the process correctly. And is an oxygen absorber, for example, at a Mylar bag, going to give you the same sense of food security, in the sense that you're really preserving your food very well if you're pulling the oxygen out of it and storing it in a food saver bag and or a food saver container and or your own canning jar in which you've used the adapter? I don't know. And I have not really found definitive advice on this on the internet. And I've not called, this is an option, something maybe I'll do, call the 1-800 number at Food Saver and ask them, or send them an email and ask them their thoughts on this. But what I have seen on the internet is that seals can break on the, when you use the jar adapter on your canning jars with the canning lid, that over time the seals can break. With the bags, sometimes, the seal doesn't hold and can leak, and air can get into it, and the same with the containers. There's all sorts of information about this on the internet where people feel the seal has failed, versus something like this that is pretty unlikely to fail. And again, what exactly is the process? What are we pulling out? Are we just pulling out all this air? It is a little unclear. And so that is something that I'm not 100% sure about. And I'm going to have to research this more, but I definitely recommend that if this is something that you're thinking about, definitely look around on the internet and see what other people have to say. But yes, the process between the two is different, because I think your oxygen absorber, I know your oxygen absorber is just pulling out oxygen, and whereas the food saver, I think, is just pulling out air in general. And what is the effect of these two different ways of preserving food for the long term? Again, I tend to lean more to Mylar bags, and for storing appropriate foods that can be stored in Mylar bags, 10% or less moisture. I always feel very conscious to stress that with your oxygen absorber. Yeah, definitely look around the internet and see what other people have to say in terms of whether they preferred using the food saver or the Mylar bag. Now, that said, I think the food saver bags can work pretty well if you're freezing food, to prevent freezer burn on your meats or your chicken and so on and so forth. That seems to have worked quite well. But for other types of food storage, for long-term storage in a prepper or extended pantry, that I think I definitely need to do more research on. And it's not something, I don't use food saver equipment to store food for very long-term extended storage, because I do worry about seals breaking or things like that. Another question I got was from someone who said that they find Mylar bags are something that they really can't afford and don't want to purchase, and can they just put their white rice right into a 5-gallon bucket and preserve it? And definitely yes. White rice is very easy to keep fresh. It's basically considered by many to be almost a forever food. It has the bran and the germ basically removed from it, and so there's very little in it to spoil. So you can put it in a 5-gallon bucket, and you can basically open the bucket, use it as you want, so on and so forth, and it's going to stay fresh. There's really not a lot that you need to do in the long run with white rice if it's not something that you want to store in Mylar bags and so on and so forth. Now, if when you're putting all your white rice in a bucket and you're thinking that you're not going to access it for a while, you really just want to put it away for long-term storage, you can go in and put in the correct amount of oxygen absorbers, seal up your bucket, and put it away for long-term storage, and you're fine. You don't need to go to the level of this where you're, putting it all in Mylar bags and so on and so forth. So it was cute because she said, "Oh, did I totally mess up?" No, you didn't totally mess up. It's fine in a 5-gallon bucket. Now, this is more of a comment, than a question, but it's something that I wanted to share with you, because depending on where you live and where you're storing your food, especially if maybe you're in a very rural area, I thought this was a terrific comment. And this was actually from a gentleman who's a hunter. And he found that in storing his food, even, doing the Mylar bag, doing the 5-gallon bucket, that if he has his food supply in his prepper pantry, extended pantry, he calls it his cache, as in C-A-C-H-E, his stash of food, that he has found that undisturbed, just leaving the food undisturbed for a long time, given enough time, that rodents have been able to chew through almost anything. And so I found that fascinating, because I think a lot of us who aren't in really rural settings and may be having a situation where we're having to put food maybe in a shed or something like that, but that given enough time, the rodents will chew through anything, including those heavy-duty 5-gallon buckets or other big type heavy-duty plastic containers. And what he found was he took his plastic buckets and he put them into metal lockers. Now, he doesn't share like where he got these metal lockers and whatnot, but probably like, almost like those foot lockers, that the kids have when they go to college, but in metal. And he put his plastic buckets into metal lockers, and they are 1/8 inch steel. So not super thick, but that's a pretty good thickness, 1/8 inch steel metal lockers. And he said that prevented 100% rodent entry. So that's I think that's an excellent tip for any of us who may be storing long-term, have our long-term food storage and be in an area where rodents are prevalent. But it seems as though 1/8 inch steel metal lockers, he says, defeats all rodent entry. So excellent. And that was from Matthew. Thank you, Matthew. I think we can all benefit from that tip. The next question I got was, will silica gel packets in a jar filled with beans kill any larvae or bugs? And chances are no. If you want to be guaranteed that you're going to kill bugs, you would need to dust your dry foods, whether it's beans or rice or whole grains, not whole grain flour, but whole grains, with diatomaceous earth. And as I shared in my video about different containers and how to store food, I don't really like using diatomaceous earth. You have to be careful with it, because if you inhale it, it can be very damaging to your esophagus and your lungs. And even though it's food grade or food safe, as it's called, and can be mixed with food, I'm just not comfortable with it. I would prefer just to use bay leaves and try to keep bugs at bay. But it doesn't kill the bugs, nor do silica gel packs. Yes, they draw out moisture, but not to the extent like diatomaceous earth does. Diatomaceous earth will scratch the exoskeleton of the bug and then dry out the exoskeleton, and it's going to kill the bugs and the larvae and anything else that's in there. But no, just using your silica gel pack, it's unlikely that that's going to help you deter bugs. But I think anything that you can do to store your food as properly as you can, whether it's a food that can be stored with oxygen absorbers or whether it's a food that can be stored with silica gel packs, and you're storing it in a proper container, that you're going to be able to do as much as you can to prevent bugs, using bay leaves, as I mentioned, and so on and so forth. The better you get at taking care of your food and storing it to the best of your ability, and over time you're going to learn what's worked and what hasn't worked for you. But often it can be a little bit of a trial and error, and a lot can depend on where you live, what type of bugs you're dealing with, what types of rodents you're dealing with, what level of humidity you're dealing with. So in the beginning there can be some trial and error. So it makes a lot of sense that as you're storing your food, check it periodically, see how it's doing. Yes, if it means that you may have to put in a fresh oxygen absorber or something like that, it may be well worth it for you to just check on your food the first couple of months so that you begin to learn what works, what doesn't work, what you can continue doing, or what you may need to change, or what different things you may need to consider, like diatomaceous earth. And on all the different videos regarding storage containers and whatnot for long-term food storage, many of you have asked for me to share the link for the Latter-day Saints site that talks about what are the best foods to store long-term and how to store them and so on and so forth. And I definitely do have all of those links over at my website for the Latter-day Saints, for the Utah State University sites, and for the USA emergency supply sites. So I've got all those links over on my website, so be sure to check that out. And now if you want more information about all of this, including what are your best containers to use, how to store your food, all about silica gel packs, all about oxygen absorbers, more than we've covered here, how to stock your pantry with real food, how to stock your pantry with real food for $5 a week, how to make homemade items to stock in your pantry, all sorts of things. Be sure to click on this video over here where I have a complete playlist where I've compiled all of this information in one place for you. And I'll see you over there in my Texas Hill Country kitchen. Love and God bless.